Welcome to the reality show. I am joined today by Morgan, Marco, and Richard, and Jonathan Doan. First time on the show. Jonathan is a blogger at Philosophy I Need It blog, which you can find in the description and in the chat. So today's title is one of those titles that people can be pissed off about, and but it's true. The title is Hamas Wins. Now, today is actually it's generally a happy day in Israel. And the reason it's a happy day, 13 of the hostages were released today. And the whole scenario around the hostages really shows the difference, I think, between the Israelis and the Palestinians. People in Israel are happy today, knowing that as far as the war is going, things are not good. But in Israel, people care about human life. And 13 people who were assumed dead or worse are now back with their families, and even the price, which is terrorists being released and the war being stopped, is something that Israelis, for the most part, I think are happy to pay that price. Now, where this goes, we will see, and we'll talk about some of what went on today. But Jonathan, I'm going to go to you first because you're a first-time guest, but also you are in Israel and can tell us to what extent what I said is correct.
Yes, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here for the first time. I hope it's the first of many. Yes, it's a terrible situation in Israel, and yes, people are very, very happy, and you can see in the news, people cheering and families reuniting. It's a very emotional, very moving scene. And yes, if you will walk around the streets of Tel Aviv like I did last week, you can see people out, people enjoying life despite the war. People are walking by the beach, enjoying a nice day. These people love their life, very life oriented, and perhaps too life oriented, because they just can't believe that their enemies are so cruel and so anti-life. It's unfathomable for some Israelis, even after October 7th. But yeah, the people, as I said, it's a sad day because this is a submission to Hamas. We're now making a deal with our killers, a deal with the people who committed the worst pogrom in modern history, after the Holocaust, of course. And yeah, but it's a mixture,
Yeah, I think this pro-life attitude in Israel, and by pro-life, I mean in favor of life, not pro-life in the American political jargon. Yeah, I think this obviously has its positives and has its negatives, and I think a misguided approach, a pro-life approach, which is what leads Israel, a large part of what leads Israel to sacrifice at a war, sacrifice lives, sacrifice opportunities to eliminate real threats in order to prevent civilians from dying. You can look at this and be hopeful, as I have been. I think on most of the shows I've been on over the past couple of months, I said I hope I'm wrong, and I hope I'm wrong here as well. And I hope Israel is actually, the reason Israel hasn't been really fighting so far is that because of the hostages, and once the hostages are out, that's when Israel will really show the full strength of its military. I don't believe that's the case. I'll be very happy to be proven wrong. Marco, Richard, your thoughts on this, on today, and generally on where the war is going?
Well, because the life of so many civilians was at play in this particular event, you can only rejoice the fact that some people have been released. However, it's a very emotional topic to talk about, because if you're talking about your family, members of your family who have been abducted, you probably, your instinct would be to try and get a compromise in order to get them out. However, if you think coldly about it, if you just use your reason and not your emotion, you also realize that by getting into these deals, you effectively legitimize those savages who take individual in order to obtain something from the side which is effectively the victim. So you not only embolden them in order to attack the victims, but also to do it in a way that guarantees them some sort of concessions. And while we are talking about this, I would like to hear back from those thousands of morons out there who were arguing, oh, this is not happened. October 7 was made up. No kids were kidnapped by the good monster of Palestinian Islamic Hamas animals. When just a few minutes ago, 4 children, one age 2, one age 4, one age 5, and one age 9 were released among the hostages. And now I would like to hear those cretins that were saying this thing didn't happen, and I would like to hear their apology.
I think from my point of view, yes, if you limit your focus on the joy of these families being reunited, then you share that joy. But what the depressing part of this is that you've just earmarked a bunch of men, women and children and vulnerable people in Israel in the moment as future hostages. And you've just taken a bunch of Palestinians, Hamas people behind bars who've got blood on their hands, who aren't among the large bunch released today, who know that they'll be next to be set free the next time that one of their fellow thugs from Hamas goes in and abducts some more innocent people in Israel. Those are the key elements, the principles that have been laid out today. So how can you rejoice when you take in that full picture? However much it's nice to see people who have been separated rejoined, and what about, of course, all of those hostages who are already dead? Little is said of those at this point as well. It's always about the joy of the reuniting, and also the undue credit given to people like Qatar for their stunning diplomacy in negotiating this. So another group that really deserves the exact opprobrium that we should be giving them is instead given the praise of being diplomatic concession makers. That's disgusting too.
Yeah. By the way, something that wasn't reported much, but Thai hostages were also released. 11 according to some media outlets, and 12 according to others. There were many Thai workers in that area of Israel working in on farms and so on. Some of you may have seen the video of some of the Thai workers being taken in a truck, and one of them being beheaded while they were being taken. So yeah, this is the organization that we see hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating, blocking the roads in support of every weekend. Morgan, your thoughts?
I probably echo what's been said already about it's obviously a very heartening and nice thing to see hostages come home. I think what probably is going to happen in the next few days is you're going to see reports and interviews of how they were treated. Something appalling that was said very early on by some Hamas official was that the hostages are going to be treated very humanely, which is of course a contradiction in terms. It's not humane to take hostages, but we'll see just how humanely they were treated, and I suspect they were treated not very well. The notable thing was that the first people who I think the hostages met before their families were psychologists to see if they were okay, and we'll see just how okay they are. And I suspect, yeah, that they're going to be very damaged by this. So it's nice that they're away from those circumstances and so on and so forth. But whilst that's all very nice, I agree with Richard, though, you can't just limit your focus or your scope just to looking at that. The fact that this has had to come at the price of a ceasefire is a terrible thing. And the reason why it's a terrible thing is that, one, it feeds into the kind of cyclical nature of these things, or of the conflict, which is that ceasefires and pauses keep happening in it and are just prolonging the conflict over time, which just leads to more Israelis, more Palestinians and so on being killed. But it's taking the pressure off Hamas, both militarily and psychologically, to prepare, regroup, reorganize and so on. And what are they preparing, reorganizing, regrouping to do is to kill more Israelis. So whilst I don't envy being in the Israeli government's position, probably with the pressure put on to do something like this, I think ultimately probably the sound thing to do would not have done it at the price of a ceasefire, at least not in the manner that they've done it. So whilst there's a kind of nice gem or kernel in this, I think ultimately this is a pretty bad thing. When the ceasefire began this morning, one of the first things that happened was, along with the actually even before the hostages came over into Egypt, was lots of fuel was sent across the border from Egypt, along with a lot of aid. And no matter how much people stress this is humanitarian aid, which is to help people, Hamas are the people with the guns there. If they want that aid, if they want that fuel, they'll get it. So, yeah, I think it's a really bad thing.
Yeah, and of course, the calls for humanitarian aid are a part of this, attempt to also separate Hamas from the Palestinian people, as if there's two opposing entities rather than them being one and the same. Here's a quote from Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, today. Our great people wrote a legendary epic of steadfastness, and our mujahideen deepened the wounds in the enemy and presented an unprecedented model of heroism and redemption. We were able with great pride to confront the occupation, break its will, and thwart its plans. Martyrs are the price of freedom, liberation, and independence. The enemy bet on the recovery of the prisoners held by Al-Qassam and the resistance through murder, genocide, and all forms of terrorism, the likes of which history has never known. All right, you don't have to read all of it, but it does show, what we knew. Again, on this channel, 2 days after this started, we had a show titled "Why Israel Can't Win," and again, to repeat it, it wasn't for military reasons. Militarily, Israel could have won by the time we did that episode. Morally, Israel, unfortunately, doesn't have conviction in its cause to the extent that Hamas does, and this is why Hamas is celebrating today a victory that is truly theirs. They got away with October 7th. They got away with taking hostages. They took hostages because they knew Israel would pay for those hostages and would accept defeat in the war in exchange for those lives. Jonathan.
Yeah, this is the most depressing thing, I think, especially for us Israelis, Razi, or ex-Israelis. Nothing changed. Nothing changed. This is the same. This is the same thing as we had in previous operations. It's just, even if an event on the scale of October 7th doesn't change anything, then what will? What will it take for the Israeli government to truly change its course? What will it take for the Israeli people to understand who you are dealing with? Nothing changes, and it's really depressing. And I know for many of my friends, we are reconsidering our future in this country, because this is a country that clearly does not stand for our own protection. Especially if you live in the south, how would the people of the south of Israel go back to their homes after this? If we just cut a deal and make a ceasefire with Hamas, how would you go back to live there? It's like, aside from the hostages, think about the economical damage. Think about the damage to industries of all various sectors, tourism, all that. It's all gone. So it's really depressing. And when this thing started, you could hear voices on Israeli television. I don't know if you've watched these, Razi, but there was this general who said, now we need to ignore the fact that there are hostages and we have to annihilate Hamas. We need to, they have to die. These hostages, they have to die. We have to destroy Hamas. Now you don't hear these voices anymore. Now we are back to the same vocabulary. So yeah, it's a very depressing situation.
Yeah, and you talk about people going back to their homes. I may have mentioned this on some show, but about a month ago, I was watching a report on Israeli television, and there was this this journalist who did a story back in 2014 after an operation there, where people, again, in that area around Gaza had to leave their homes, and he was following 4 different mothers and their children, and they were talking about how, difficult it is. You have to leave your home for months, and then eventually some of them came back, and some of them left. And in this article last month, he wanted to reconnect with these four mothers, and so one had already left the area, the other two I don't remember, and then a fourth one had been murdered with her son, who was also interviewed in that story in 2014. So yeah, I don't know who in their right mind would go back there, but it's not just the north, it's not just the south, it's also the north, because in the north we haven't seen this operation yet because they haven't determined that it's time yet. We know something like this is coming from the north. We know something big will happen when Hezbollah decides that it's going to happen, and unfortunately, Israel's military response, half-assed military response to Hamas is a statement to all of Israel's enemies. Marco, Richard.
Yeah, I mean, the most, as Jonathan was saying, effectively, the government of Israel is painting red crosses on the back of his own citizens. And I totally understand his feeling, the feeling of his friends. I mean, how can you feel safe when your own government doesn't at least comes out with a rhetoric, we're going to protect our citizens? At least pretend you're going to do that. But then to cave in to international pressure to this extent, especially because we kind of seen a new phenomenon in the West as well. We have tribalistic minorities who fuel hate in the streets and effectively promote a value, a disvalue, which would never be accepted in our society if you were presented under a different guise. If you went in the street and said, "Oh, I don't like Jews," people will, call the police on you or at least tell you off. But if you go around and dress up with a cloth on your head and start saying Allah Akbar, that's all fine. Suddenly, every tribalistic goon out there will join the march and ask for Israel to give up his right to defend itself. And imagine if this happened with Ukraine. Imagine if the international community came together and said, "Oi, Russia, get off Ukraine's land," and put the same pressure on Ukraine or on Russia. We wouldn't have Crimea, we wouldn't have the war now. But for some reason, when we're talking Israel, automatically the rules of the game go out of the window, and the bad guy is automatically assumed to be Israel.
I think the rhetoric, if it's not consistent, quickly undermines itself. So next time, and every time, who's going to believe even the first line of rhetoric that sounds strong and rightfully on the correct message? And secondly, I think what you're seeing in terms of the release of the hostages here is a conflation in the emotive response to it, as if you're seeing a bunch of coal miners being released from a trapped mine where some natural accident or industrial action or whatever has occurred, and they've been rescued. And you've got the Red Cross driving them out with their flag flying high in the center of the screen, getting a massive PR boost out of this, when we know it's the likes of the Red Cross and other organizations with their altruistic motives and their often dubious double standards that are allowing aid to exactly the people who perpetrate this kind of violence. So everything about it is taking the key principles, turning them on their head and making them meaningless. And you're just seeing all of it destroyed before your eyes, which is very hard to take.
Yeah, on the Daily Objective, right before the show, I interviewed Douglas Carswell, who's a former member of parliament in the UK for the Conservative Party, and we were talking about Labour, and we were talking about how Keir Starmer got in trouble with his own party because he didn't immediately call for a ceasefire. This has been the case with politicians who are not 100% anti-Israel and didn't call for a ceasefire. This makes them look bad. This makes anybody who stood with Israel look bad when Israel is doing what its enemies wanted it to do. Now, again, this is supposedly temporary, supposedly for what, just until they release the hostages. they will release, but it certainly looks bad at the moment for Israel. And we've been saying that it looks bad for 49 days. I'm still hoping on day 53 or day 54, we'll see, the hostages released. We'll see nothing left of Gaza, and Israel will be on to southern Lebanon and the West Bank and actually doing what it should be doing. Morgan, is that happening?
No, not really. So I mean, one of the reasons why this deal should be depressing is, I guess, what I was kind of getting at before, is that the way the conflict has gone in the past is that it's eventually ground to a halt, that the Israeli government has eventually buckled under international pressure to go for a ceasefire or a protracted peace, whatever, even though that's very clearly not really in their interest, even though they know it'll pop up in a few years again, as it has done. The last time I think it broke out on a similar scale was 2021. It wasn't all that long ago. And the reason why the hostage deal should make you feel a bit depressed is because it seems to be the first sign of things going that way. There was an article in an Israeli news I was reading, which was speculating just about that. Is this the first kind of sign of the end for this stage of the conflict? I think anyone who really has Israel's best interests in mind should really hope that this is the end of this part of the conflict, like the conflict with Gaza. This should be the end of that. There might be things that go on in the future beyond that to do with some of Israel's neighbors or to do with other Palestinian groups, but with Hamas, this has to be the end of it. So I feel quite depressed about that. I also feel quite depressed about the Western response, which I think we've generally spoken about quite a bit. And the silence, there was an interesting article about the silence from feminist groups about this. Now, there's a lot more groups aside from feminist groups which deserve to be picked on for this, but there was an awful lot of testimony about the violence against women, which came out on the 7th of October, and that it was sexual violence. And there's some awful testimony about that, which people can go and find. And why on earth do they not view it as their job to stand up for the Israeli women who were defiled on that day? And why on earth are our countries, Western countries, as Israel's allies, kind of making that point? Or utilizing these feminist groups to put more pressure onto the people who are supporting Hamas. I don't know. Anyway, I guess my ultimate point is there's an awful lot of things which are getting me down about this, and it all stems from the hostage deal.
Well, one thing that always helps is super chats, and we have a few of them. Thank you, Jonathan Honig, for 2 super chats. Thank you, Robert Nacer, also 2 super chats. One of them is in Latin. I'm not going to read it unless it's more than a placeholder, and then send it to me in English or Hebrew. But he did say YouTube is not allowing me to send super chats. So, yeah. Kathleen sends a very generous super chat and says, thank you all so much for your efforts. One of the few places to hear an objective view of current affairs with a proper moral foundation. Your clarity and consistency is admirable and inspiring in these times. Thank you, Kathleen. We are trying our best, and as we mentioned in the previous show, this is it's all recovering at the moment, and I think we're doing a good job of it. And we're doing a better job than most, although that's not difficult to achieve. Morgan, you mentioned the left's kind of infighting and or infighting, even infighting in one person's mind, like with leftist views. It's difficult to put them all together into one coherent view of the world. I mentioned also in the previous show how I was sitting in a cafe next to people, and one of them was saying that she didn't see any evidence of the rapes and so on, and then says, yeah, but hashtag believe her and so on. And she was struggling because she needs to support vicious evil Islamic terrorists on the one hand, and also always believe women when they accuse men on the other. To some extent, I hope, and I have friends who are more optimistic about this than I am, that the left will defeat itself because of intersectionality and all these different views. I'm not sure what we'll have as an alternative to the left. That's going to be much better. But yeah, it's besides it being nauseating to look at the left nowadays, it's also kind of fascinating in a way. Jonathan, your thoughts viewing the left in the West. I think in Israel there's not many left-wing voices nowadays. They will start hearing them again soon, probably.
I can already hear some of them on the X these days. They're starting to raise their ugly heads, but yes, in Israel, you can see disillusionment of a lot of people with the left, with the global left. Oh, before I say that, I should say a disclaimer that I don't speak for my employer. I forgot to say that when we started. So yes.
You don't speak for the blog Philosophy I Needed, because that's the only employer we mentioned.
Yes, I don't speak for any other employers that I have, whom I should mention. So, interesting thing about the feminist thing. It used to be in Israel, whenever there was a rape by an Arab in Israel, nobody from the feminist organizations inside Israel would condemn the rape because it was an Arab, which I find rather interesting. But yeah, this is people in Israel. They now look at the entire world in shock. They look at the demonstration. I was in London during the big demonstration, and seeing all these Palestinian flags, it's really shocking. Even if you are an objectivist, it's still shocking to see that when you're there in person, and it's really terrible. And again, yeah, Razi?
Yeah, some of us told you to stay away from that part of London on that particular day, but that's what happens when you don't listen.
Well, I don't submit to terror. I didn't want to submit to terror, and I didn't want to let them destroy Trafalgar Square and conquer the National Gallery. So I still went there. They didn't disturb me there, but when I went outside, they were there, and it was terrible and ugly and disgusting. Yeah.
I want to just talk a bit more about the Israeli left, because we don't hear them in part because we don't want to, but if you do look, B'Tselem is still around. They're still left. There was a demonstration in Israel like a week ago or so by the Israeli Communist Party, right?
Oh yeah.
Against the war or for a ceasefire or something like that, where the former speaker of the Knesset was one of the speakers. So yeah, any further thoughts on the Israeli left on is it I think in Israel many cultural and political things had to take time to be imported from the West. I think the multi-gender issue is just starting with environmental.
Oh yeah, we've had that for a long time. We have had these issues for a long time. But now after the war, I think the biggest leftist factors are the people leading the country. I think Netanyahu is the biggest leftist, if we are to use these terms appropriately. He is advancing the leftist worldview that we should submit to the Palestinians, we should cave. This is the biggest danger that I see. The fringe communist youth, they just want to annoy people. They just want to fight with people. They're young, stupid people. I don't think they're representing anything significant from within Israel. But the government does, and the government is acting in a manner that would not shame any leftist from before the massacre. So I would say, Razi, that our anger should be directed at them the most, and they are the influential ones, and they should be condemned, and we should spend as much time as we can to tell that terrible man and all of the essentially all the politicians, because they all had a hand in it. They all were part of this mechanism. Gantz he was the chief of staff. He was proud in his sacrificing his soldiers to protect Palestinians in the 2014 war. They're all a part of this leftist altruistic worldview. So
yeah, by the way, just one more point on that. So somebody texted me, and I haven't replied yet, about an hour ago, about Gantz asking if he's better than Netanyahu. Let me this is a friend of the channel, so even though it wasn't a super chat, I'm going to ask Jonathan, what do you think?
If Gantz is better than Netanyahu? Well, should you
Right now, you
die
have to
with...
vote between one of the two of them. Who are you voting for?
I would vote for Netanyahu, for Gantz, because Netanyahu has to go. The man who has led 14 years of appeasement, and he's still like, think about appeasement. Chamberlain, for 28 months, he led appeasement, and then people from within forced him out. Nobody, and he realized that he was wrong. Nobody realized, Netanyahu didn't realize that he was wrong. And nobody from within the Likud party, which is the Tories of Israel, nobody tells him to go away, make room for Churchill. No, there's nobody like that. And Gantz is, of course, not a Churchill, but I would much rather have someone who doesn't carry that burden of 14 years of appeasement and failure.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I mean, my answer to that question is also I would vote for Gantz over Netanyahu just because Netanyahu is Netanyahu. He's been in power. He shouldn't be there. I don't know that Gantz is going to be better, but I know that if he is prime minister, that means Netanyahu is not, and that's good enough for me. Thank you, Ginger, for the very generous super chat. And Marco, Richard, you live in London. Allegedly, I mean, that's borderline, far east of London. But tomorrow's protest, I'm wondering what it's going to look like. I'm assuming, I haven't even looked, I'm assuming every Saturday they're going to protest. Is this going to be a victory celebration? Is it going to be, are they going to be sad that these women and children were released? What exactly is, what are we expecting?
I don't see we're going to see an end to these protests every Saturday for the foreseeable future. I'm sure there'll be much of that, and of course, the problem that you've got at the moment is that you've stopped the ability to say, Israel has stopped the ability to say that it won't negotiate with terrorists, and that's what they're going to be celebrating on the streets of places like London. In reference to what you were saying earlier about the left, I just wanted to point out that it's reality that's the enemy of the left every time, and that any professors in Ivy League ivory towers can sit there drawing all the power pyramids they want, but when they actually meet the world and try and herd around those tribes and control them as one collective unit for their own purposes, that's when eventually the things collapse and falls apart, and that's what we're beginning to, what hopefully we're beginning to see as it does pull itself apart. But what follows that is going to need some solid principles to improve on it, rather than just be an out-and-out dictatorship from the off. But yes, on the streets of London, you're continuing to see protests. I still see more and more Palestinian flags flying in off cars, windows, backs of bicycles, all those kind of things. And I've not, in shop windows, I've yet to see a single Israeli flag anywhere I've been in London. And I suspect anyone who did have the, what would be deemed in London the temerity to fly one would end up with a brick through their window. So I understand that, but it's, yeah. I do believe there is a march, I think it's this weekend, that is in support of Israel. And there have been a few of those, and we ought to mention some of those because they've been extremely different to the Palestinian marches so far. They've been, peaceful, often quiet, very respectful, and quite moving in many cases, with people giving very firm but principled speeches at many of those.
Yeah, we often, just very quickly, I'll make a point. We often make the point to people, when you judge a conflict, judge which side would you rather live on. And I think that also applies to when you look at these protests, like, which side is the side you'd rather, the people on that side are the people you'd rather be around. And I think we can see that in how the two sides protest. Marco.
Well, I think the ceasefire actually is bad on two accounts. One, because it just emboldens these lefty with the lovely feeling glow of seeing these scenes of the lovely Hamas people returning the hostages and all the scenes of the family reunited. So that they're going to be really high on this, knowing that they've caused all this. On the other hand, Israel's mistake will be effectively unraveling its own military strategy. I mean, if you know anything about how did the Middle Age set up siege to a castle, You just do it by stopping them from getting supplies. And when they eventually give in, even if they're not militarily beaten, they are morally beaten, physically beaten. They haven't got food and water. Here, effectively, you are undoing what you've done the last month by allowing Hamas to refuel, to restock, to even change, the guard in whoever is hiding in the buildings in Gaza, in the tunnels. So this whole thing is a massive, massive mistake on so many levels.
Yeah, I think one thing where we have kind of a unique strength is in pointing out this kind of stuff. When people advocate for a ceasefire, when people advocate for humanitarian aid, they are siding with Hamas. This is not out of some concern for you. Are actually saying the things that you want done. The things that you want done are things that would strengthen the people who committed those atrocities on October 7th. And there's no two ways about it. It's yeah, and unfortunately, by the way, the journalists who interview people on both sides don't ask the hard-hitting questions like Kay Burley asked of Elon Levy. They don't ask those kinds of questions when somebody advocates for a ceasefire or for humanitarian aid. I mean, you're not going to attack somebody. You're not going to challenge somebody who's for humanitarian aid. What are you, against humanitarian aid? Like that's uncalled for or unthinkable. Thank you, Walter, for the super chat. Bet Cali says, I don't like this deal. 150, very worried about this. Yeah, that's 150 terrorists. These are unsuccessful terrorists, or not successful enough because their victims didn't die. This is why they're being released. Now, again, the way this is being reported is women and children. Well, women, first of all, this whole sexist notion of like women, let's drop the view of women that seems to be shared by Islamists and feminists, that there are somehow lesser people, so we send the women and children first. No, these are terrorists who happen to be female, and the rest are terrorists who happen to have been under the age of 18, not by much, in almost every case, as far as I know. So yeah, 150 terrorists are being released. Morgan.
Well, I'm not sure what I'm responding to, but I guess
me neither. I just went on a rant and I thought it's your turn.
No, fair enough. I guess since you originally asked Jonathan about the Israeli left, I need to ask Jonathan a question. Then I hope it's not shirking my statement. Where is the Israeli political spectrum swinging to at the moment? Because you'd expect in a time of war, it'll shift a bit. And one of the things that at least I'm seeing in the news coming out of Israel is that, unfortunately, the only people who seem to be saying sensible things about national security and so on seem to be perhaps unsavory figures coming from the religious right. And so are you seeing a general sympathy towards parties from the religious right, or where is it staying at the moment?
So yes, there is according to polls they're doing now, there's an overwhelming majority to the opposition. That is Gantz and other opposition parties. All the parties from the right have taken a massive blow in the polls. I think all of them. So there's definitely a call for change. I as much as it seems unthinkable, I think Netanyahu is finished with this one. I think it will be very hard for him to come out of this as another winner for the next election. Now it depends when the election will be. People tend to forget very quickly, and Netanyahu is a known magician. So perhaps there would be a change. I wouldn't be too surprised if that will happen. But right now there is definitely a nationwide call for a change of government. But the people they want to change to are essentially the same people who propagated the same failure, the same appeasement. So left, right, I don't think these are proper terms to describe Israeli politics. I don't think it really exists. It's faces, it's about personalities. Which face do you want? Do you think Gantz is more handsome or Netanyahu is more handsome? It's all about aesthetics, really.
Yeah, and when we do talk about left and right in Israeli politics, we talk about it's very hard to define those terms anywhere that I follow the political system. But in Israel, it's different from elsewhere. I mean, it's not. I think in the UK and the US, it's kind of socialism and a little bit less socialism is the left and the right, whereas in Israel, historically at least, it's very much about your attitude towards Israel's Arab neighbors. Do you want to give them what they supposedly want in exchange for peace, which is a weird kind of deal, and or do you want Israel to be strong and defend itself? Now, this government, we spoke about this when the elections happened and the coalition was being built. This was called the most right-wing government in Israel's history. And it's been very right-wing in all the bad things. And the one thing where we would have liked them to be right-wing, I haven't really seen that. But yeah, I think Morgan, there are some voices in Israel that are not religious right, that are actually ex-military people who say we should go in there and win. And I know that Yaron Brook is going to do a show in Hebrew starting in I don't know when, Jonathan, maybe you know when, but this was in part when Raka did his solo episode here. He called on people to demand a show in Hebrew, and apparently that worked. So I'm looking forward to that. I don't know if it's going to be translated, but I will be watching. So
watch it with subtitles. So it'd be interesting to hear those ex-military voices that are better coming out of Israel then. But just so, like, to prepare for this show, often I read the Times of Israel, for example, and they often refer to people as being on the far right. And I agree, it's strange to decide what exactly does that mean in Israel, because in countries that aren't Israel, it means something, how holding unsavory opinions about the Jews, for example. So what does it even mean in Israel to be far right? And then it'll be something like there was a guy who was fired from the cabinet for saying that, not that he wanted to nuke Gaza, but that nuclear weapons were just a possibility, and he's referred to being as far right.
Was he fired?
I think so, yeah.
I don't think so. No, I think he's still a minister. I think he was suspended from the cabinet, but I don't think he was fired. People in Israel don't get fired so long as they work in government.
Yeah, it's also not a very intelligent statement, but it's actually the right sentiment.
Well, if you read the full interview, then I don't think he was that loony. I think I would pick him over anyone else right now in Israel.
Did he recognize the fact that nuking Gaza would kill many Israelis?
Yeah, but it wasn't really saying we should nuke Gaza. It was like asked, what do we do? They asked me in the interview. So what would you do with Gaza? Nuke Gaza? And he's like, it's a possibility, but we should do. And there was a full paragraph that followed that. So you should read the full context. But he was one of the less bad guys, I would say. But he's religious, so you don't want to trust him. So I would say far right. Usually they are settlers. They're pro settlements. They live in settlements. They're very religious. Nationalism, the great Jewish nation. They want to build the temple on Al-Aqsa, and they want to do crazy things. But actually, if they were competent, which they are not, they would have been the better option. Absolutely.
By the way, Riley Holbrook asks Ben Gvir, if you're asking if he's the person who said this, no, it was somebody in his party, right? Jonathan, do you remember who it was?
Yes, I think he was Amichai Eliyahu. He's a minister for some made-up ministry.
Yeah. There are a lot of ministers for something, because part of the coalition deal is you have to give people ministerial jobs, so they make up.
Israel has 38 ministers. 38
ministers, but the whole parliament is 120 people, and the coalition is 60 something, right? So most people in the coalition are ministers. It's an interesting political system, which we've spoken about, and I'm sure we'll speak about again. And Yair says in the chat, ideology is dead in Israel. I think, again, something that was discussed in the previous episode, ideology is dead in most places except on the left. Like there are some on the left who are real ideologues. The people who demonstrated in Israel in favor of a ceasefire, i.e. in favor of Hamas, they're ideologues. Unfortunately, it's the worst kinds of ideologies are still alive, and maybe we can go back to the point to which to the extent that that's true here in the UK. Marco, Richard, any thoughts on that?
Or
on anything else?
Yeah. I was thinking about your earlier comment as well. I wouldn't know whether to swipe left or swipe right on Israeli politicians, but I would like to know that some more of them had actually read Netanyahu's book and actually implemented it, unlike Netanyahu himself. That would at least elevate them above some of the others.
To be honest, I wouldn't associate ideology with the left here in Britain, because they seem to kind of have a sort of direction, but then anything that comes their way, they're gonna either embrace it or vilify it. So I don't actually see a coherent ideology on the left either. I'm afraid we are on a free-for-all right now, and which is quite understandable when you have a bunch of people who take any idea that flows by and makes it theirs, and that's a natural outcome for it.
So I don't know if I agree with the idea that ideology is dead from the super chatter. I think that was what they said. It seems to me that ideology is probably as strong as it's been for the last 50 years or so. There's lots of ways in which people compromise, and there's also ways in which politicians compromise. But in terms of sort of general people, kind of the grassroots level, I think people are longing for ideology and ideological strength and all that kind of stuff, because they sense the vacuum of it in the kind of postmodern skeptical era. And so, why did Jordan Peterson's conference in London, whatever the hell it was called, the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, I think it was, why did that do so well? Because they were setting out an ideological vision and people really respond to that. Why did Jeremy Corbyn do so well amongst his own group? He might not have done well with the party, with the country, but why did he do well with kind of Labour Party voters? It was because he was ideological.
Well, sorry.
No, go on, sorry.
Well, I don't consider that ideology at all. It's just mostly parroting the same old tribe. I mean, these guys are still chanting the same stuff that we're chanting when they were, hippies in the 60s. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn, what is it? It's just a washout from the 70s. I don't actually hear anything new or anything consistent coming from the hard left. Even the Momentum, which is the side that supports the hard left that supports Jeremy Corbyn, it's just the same old warmed up stuff.
Well, I think it is as well, but that's about the kind of freshness of it. Whereas I think it is ideological. Like what was the Labour motto under him, which I think they might even still keep. And he's just actually published a book of poetry, for goodness sake, under this title. It's "For the Many, Not the Few." That is essentially a nice little motto that sums up an ideological, moral message, which is about the people, collective, whatever. But I think at least it's my view that I think people want ideology very much.
And that slogan is frequently parodied as "For the many, not the Jew," and that's probably more accurate, to be honest. I think the ideology is what I was talking about earlier in terms of the left and reality. It's the fact that they cling to the stuff from the ivory towers, the age-old Marxism that's been knocking about for donkey's yonks, and its practical implementation is always a total failure, because it is a failure from its ideological standpoint to begin with, and yet none of them will give up on it.
By the way, I was also going to make that point about the way for the many, not the few is parody, but that slogan alone is terrifying enough when you think about it. It's basically, you're either with the majority or we're coming for you. And there's definitely a hunger for ideology, which is why Jeremy Corbyn was so successful, and especially against Theresa May, who said nothing. And as she said nothing, as the campaign was going on, he got stronger and she got weaker. In Boris Johnson's case, at least you could see something coherent, mostly because it was Brexit, and his slogan "Get Brexit Done" was as close to an ideology as anything you could see from the Conservative Party. I wanted to quickly, I scrolled a lot to find this, but this was Jeremy Corbyn at 1:27 p.m. on October 7th. So as the terrorist attack was coming to an end, and Israel, of course, hadn't responded yet in any way. The unfolding events in Israel and Palestine are deeply alarming. We need an immediate ceasefire and urgent de-escalation, and we need a route out of this tragic cycle of violence. Ending the occupation is the only means of achieving a just and lasting peace. So while women were being raped, babies were being slaughtered, civilians aged 6 months to 85 years were taken hostage, Jeremy Corbyn was tweeting in support of the people who were doing this. And he's, if not ideological, I think he is ideological, but he's certainly consistent, I would say, in when it comes to Israel. I think the one place where Jeremy Corbyn was criticized about not being principled was was Brexit, where he was clearly in favor of it, but couldn't say that because some of the left was against it. There are a few comments. I know I'm breaking the rules here, not being ideological enough myself and reading some non-super chat comments, but I will do that anyway. Christopher says Jonathan for PM. He's legally too young to actually be prime minister in Israel. But he can be a member of Knesset, actually, I think.
I can run to the Knesset. You can
run for Knesset. You can't be prime minister.
I'm not sure. Maybe prime minister is 25. I'm not sure.
I think it's more than that.
We'll change the law. We'll run for the Knesset, and we'll change the law, and we can do it.
This is another question. I think it's directed at Jonathan, but I'm going to answer it as well. What about Moshe Feiglin? He's at least a little less religious, more of a Ben Shapiro. No, he's not less religious. He's just better on other issues. He's more religious than any of these people. He actually believes the shit he says. Now, some of it is good when it comes to policy, but yeah, he's anyway, Jonathan, you know him better than I do. I'm not going to elaborate. Yeah. You can if you want, but yeah, your thoughts on Feiglin.
So I was a part of Mr. Feiglin's party in 2019 when he ran. It was called Zehut Party. It was very early in my stage of ideological or philosophical development.
Zehut, just to translate, means identity.
Identity, yes. And the central idea is that Judaism, which as our identity, equals liberty, and which I'm sure many of you can understand, get a grasp of what is wrong there. But yeah, he had some good ideas. He was for free market. He had a very nice. Speaking of ideology, he was the only one with a platform. He literally published a book, 350 pages of the platform of what he's going to do, apply to all aspects of Israeli society. It was very, very elaborate. He brought a nice list of people, some very good economists, even one objectivist whom we know here, some of us. So from that aspect, it was as good as it gets, and he actually had a chance of winning. But as he lost, very close to the
chance of winning, as in chance of getting into parliament, not chance of becoming prime minister.
Chance of entering the Knesset. Yeah, he was missing about 15 to 20,000 votes, which was very, very sad for me and for a lot of us in the pre-freedom camp. But as things moved, he became crazier and more explicit. And he said, for example, he was hiding it before, but he was saying that he wants to build the temple, and he's longing for the moment where we can build the temple on the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Mount Temple, in Jerusalem, where the Muslim mosque is, and he's. It's just and a few days ago he actually did a new video on his Facebook. I don't know if you've seen that, Razi. But he said that Israelis need to rally behind the idea of the Israeli people, and we need to defeat the Arabs. We need to sacrifice for the Israeli people, for the sake of the Israeli people. We need to sacrifice our lives. It was very collectivistic, very mystical. He's a deeply religious man, and we should stay away from him and be careful, because people who are on the surface level, they seem like us. He called for Gaza to become Dresden. He called for that, and I agree with him. But the reasons he wants to make Gaza Dresden are not identical to our reasons. He agrees that Hamas needs to be annihilated, but he thinks that it is because this land belongs to us. Gaza belongs to the Jewish people, and we need to go back to Gaza. We need to make Jewish settlements there. This is part of our identity, and so we have to sacrifice for it. But we can do if you want, we can do a much more thorough. I need to prepare more, but I can have a lot of things to say about Feiglin.
Yeah, there's definitely he's an interesting character, and I think, you know, if I was hoping he would get into parliament. I think if I was in parliament with him, we would probably vote the same way on many things, but yeah, probably not on, you know, the God stuff. I mean, and he had his weird, you know, when he was about to enter parliament, it looked like he might be the you know, an important vote in the like coalition discussions. It looked like he might have power there, and he said, "My red line is marijuana legalization." Now, I'm all for that, but it was his red line, and he kept repeating, "This is a life and death issue." Look, it's not a life. Getting high is not a life and death issue. It's I mean, he had a further explanation of that, but it was kind of bullshit. So yeah, but again, when you look at the politicians you have, he looks better than when you look at the politicians you want. Thank you, Bonnie, for the super chat. Any last thoughts? We do have a hard stop for the briefly objective, but any final thoughts, Marco, Richard, Morgan?
I'll just say that since we were talking about it before, it's a slight digression, but Jeremy Corbyn's quote of "for the many, not the few" comes from a very good poem by Percy Shelley called The Mask of Anarchy, and in which he's defending, when he's saying "I'm for the many, not the few," he's for the few in that case are aristocrats who are sort of murdering the peasants. It's not billionaires who he wants to steal all the money from. So Corbyn isn't really right in quoting that poem, and it's a very good poem. So I just defend it on that ground. But that's all I have to say.
And I just point out that I think Razi mentioned this was the 49th day of the war so far, somewhere around then. And clearly this is a significant day among those among the recent set, and it's probably a turning point when Israel is beginning to sadly fly the white flag.
Marco, nothing to add?
Well, no, I mean, that's exactly the point. As I said before, here the military strategy is totally blown apart, and how you're going to recover from this one, I don't know.
Jonathan, any final thoughts before we part?
Final thoughts. It was very nice to be here, and I hope that most of us, especially Israelis, who are now feeling a bit down, to put it mildly, will try to focus on the nicer things in life that you can still pursue, and enjoy some beautiful art. So I suggest go and subscribe to my blog and read more about art. Thank you very much for having me here. And we need more super chats, Razi.
Thanks. I don't know if I mentioned Bonnie's super chat, so I'll mention it maybe for the second time. Thank you, Bonnie. I will be back. There's no reality show on the weekend, but I will be back for the Daily Objective tomorrow. I will be interviewing David Deutsch. He is a prominent intellectual in the UK. I recommend everybody watch that. And the reality show will be back on Monday. We do have a Briefly Objective premiering in a few seconds. Daniel, I don't know what the title for that is. Do you want to tell us quickly so that people can be, yeah, go ahead.
The Nature of Hamas.
The Nature of Hamas, that's starting in a few seconds. So if you're watching live, you can click over. There's a link in the live chat, and subscribe to the Briefly Objective. That channel has produced some of the shorts that we see on this channel that have been doing very well recently. So thanks, Marco and Richard, for your work on that, and thanks everybody for joining and for watching. And we'll see you back on the channel tomorrow. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Recording stopped.